Good morning, Senators. Thank you very much for your patience, and to members of our community who are watching the legislature in session during the Committee in the Whole on Bill number 157-34 regarding the Port Authority of Guam going out to the bond market to acquire some financing for critical infrastructure projects that will be paid directly out of the revenues generated by the Port Authority of Guam. I'd like to commence this. I know Vice Speaker Talai had the floor, and we are on page 41. Before I proceed with entertaining Vice Speaker Talai, I do have a document that needs to be circulated to everyone, and I will ask the representative from the Guam Economic Development Authority to please read the document. What this is, Senators, is there was a request that in fact bond counsel chime in with the provisions that are reflective of part of the discussions of the legislature, and this is the response that was provided. I'd like to recognize the presence of Speaker Cruz, Vice Speaker Talai, Senator San Nicolas, Senator San Augustine, Senator Tom Atta, Senator Telina Nelson, Senator Mary Torres, Senator Luis Muñoz, Senator Will Castro, Senator Fernando Esteves, Senator James Espaldon, and Senator Tommy Morrison. Thank you very much, Senators, for joining us this morning. As the document is being circulated, I would like to ask the representative from the Guam Economic Development Authority, Ms. Tina Garcia, to go ahead and read the communication. I'm sorry. As we proceed, Senators, based on the discussions with our legal counsel, the advice was that the passage of legislation out of this body by virtue of the ruling of the Guam Supreme Court will be in accordance with that, but that the provisions of the standing rules that's reflective of the activities on the floor with the Committee in the Whole, the passage of amendment still remains intact. So based on that advice by our legal counsel, we will still necessitate in the Committee in the Whole 8 affirmative votes for the passage of any amendment that is proffered by members of the body on this legislation as I presently chair the Committee in the Whole. Thank you very much, Senators. Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This email is in response to the question about moving forward with the borrowing without changing the section in the current port statute. And this came from Bond Counsel Christine Rankin from Oric, Harrington, and Sutcliffe. The proposed port legislation was developed collaboratively and with a great deal of thought and input from GITA, the port, underwriters, their counsel, and bond counsel, with the goal of modernizing the port's borrowing authorization from the existing law, which dates back to 1975 and/or the 1980s. The provisions are intentionally consistent with and modeled after Guam Code annotated provisions for other Guam autonomous agencies, in particular Guam Waterworks Authority, with the goal of putting the port on the best footing for market acceptance. From a very technical drafting standpoint, the most common and efficient way to accomplish this is to repeal the current applicable law and to replace it with provisions that are comprehensive and designed to work together. We are happy to answer any questions that I think she meant may, come up about the history of the process. Many thanks. Christine Cadman Rankin, Senior Associate, Oric, Harrington, and Sutcliffe. My apologies, but John Wong, our bond counsel, also the partner in Oric, is actually in London for a meeting summit and wasn't able to respond to me. But he is also copied on this email correspondence.
Thank you very much, Ms. Garcia. With that particular presentation, we will revert back to Vice Speaker Talai. You have the floor. We are on page 41.
Point of information?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, please state your point of information.
I appreciate the email. I was just wondering, could Gita inform us whether or not there was any attempt to include legal counsel from the legislature or any of the counsels from the legislature in this collaborative effort?
No, sir, we have not included legislative counsel in this or previous bond drafting legislation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for your point of information or inquiry. Vice Speaker Talai, you're recognized. Page 41. Senators, page 41.
Mr. Chair, before we proceed.
Yes, Senator Espadon.
Yes, and this is in reference to the letter by the by Orrick Harrington.
Senator Espadon, Vice Speaker Talai, will you yield the time at this moment?
Well,
okay. Senator Espadon, only
you.
because she had the floor.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You may proceed because it's in reference to what was just read.
It's reference to what was just read, and I just need to ask if the question was posed to the council or to Orrick Harrington. If the question was posed of whether or not we could conceivably go to market without the revisions to, and go forward with existing law and to the bond market. Was that question posed?
Yes, the question posed was, would we be able to move forward with without the revisions made? And their response is they had to make all these updates in order for us to enter the market.
No, the response was, in their opinion, that it would put the port on the best footing, and so they did not really answer that question of a yes or a no. They just gave a generalized opinion that this would put us perhaps in a better footing, and which I could probably agree to, but it didn't answer the question of whether or not we could conceivably go to the bond market under existing statute.
The other point that the other thing that we do have to remember is the original port legislation was written as, I believe, a line agency, and we're creating since then the port has been established as an autonomous agency. So,
and under its provision as an autonomous agency, are there any provisions there that allows it to go to bond market?
There are provisions for them to go to the bond market.
Right, and so the question still remains without, of whether the port can go to the bond market under the existing statute as an autonomous agency under the old rules. And again, it's not very clear whether council addressed it with a yes or a no, because really in the end, that is going to be the answer to, I think, the question that many of us in this hall have. And again, so I just want to make, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make that comment that in spite of this communication from bond counsel, it does not state whether or not, does not answer the question of whether the port can go to market. I mean, it might be, they only answered that if we revise it, it would be better footing or the best footing, but it did not answer whether or not the port can go under existing statute to the bond market and conceivably be successful. I just want to note that for the record. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. Vice Speaker Talai, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to point out a couple items that I would, I guess, like consideration, but I think that there are still some overall bill items that hopefully other speakers will address or make amendments. On page 42, there's a line in here on line 15. This says what we are going to do after all bonds have been fully paid. And on line 15, it says that even after all bonds have been fully paid, discharged, that the surplus monies in any fund or account created by this article shall, subject to the limitations and restrictions in any indenture, be transferred to the authority. Now, I agree. Of course, when the bonds are paid, the money should all go back to the authority. I would like to strike the clause that says subject to the limitations and restrictions in any indenture, because I do not want an indenture that says that after we have fully paid the bonds, we are still subject to some kind of indenture. I want our indenture to say that after we have fully paid the bonds, the money goes back to the port where it should go, and that we are free and clear. And so I want to remove the words subject to the limitations and restrictions in any indenture, comma.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Speaker. Senators, on page 42, line 15, the proposal by the Vice Speaker is to delete the phrase subject to the limitations and restrictions in any indenture. Any discussion or questions, concerns regarding that particular amendment? If not, no objections. Any objections? Yes, Senator Espadon, you're recognized.
I understand and I appreciate, and I really do appreciate this motion. However, after all bonds have been fully paid, in other words, it talks about not only this particular bond borrowing, but any bond that might be borrowed on top of this going forward. And I think that that phrase that is being moved to be deleted basically addresses that you might be free under the bond that you do pay off, but if there are any other bonds out there, then we're still subject. All funds then go towards any of the clauses in any indenture that might still exist. And so I guess you know, in thinking about it, that might, you know, it might be an innocuous deletion, and so I don't object to it, because we would still be held accountable to any indenture that might be out there, regardless of whether this is in or out. But I just wanted to make note that this is after all bonds shall have been fully paid, and that this, I guess that's a little bit of confusion to me. After all bonds, all. So if there are 2 or 3 bonds out there, this section really speaks to after all. If there are 2 or 3 out there, after all of those have been fully paid, then we're subject to it. So I don't object to this. You know, like I said, I'm just trying to think it through out loud, but no objection.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. Any other comments on the proposed amendment? There being no objection, question is being called. Amendment passes. Senators, as we propose amendments, please, I'm going to ask you all to ensure that proper coordination is made with the clerks so that they don't skip a beat on any of the amendments that have been adopted. Vice Speaker Talai, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask Gita, on page 43 and throughout this bill, whenever we talk about pledging revenue, they say shall be secured by all. I'm looking at line 21, for example, but it's throughout the bill. Shall be secured by all or by part of revenues. And what does Gita intend to secure this with? Part of the revenues or all of the revenues?
The intent is we would pledge the port revenues, all of the port revenues defined today.
All right, thank you. All right, and then, Mr. Chair, on page 45, I just want to point out again that the speaker had brought up earlier on line 20 and on the next page on line 9, that there's 2 things that are going on in this one revenue bond that's being authorized, and that although we've put individual numbers, we did not put a cap on the totals there, and I'm not sure if we need to, but like we don't put a cap on the overall amount, or sorry, no, yeah, we do in subsection 4. So I take that back, Mr. Chair, we're done with that one. I'd like to now go back to the word system, and well, actually just...
Senator, because the Vice Speaker has exhausted all of her questions throughout the entire document, I'm going to ask you for your consideration. We allow her to be able to go back to system before we entertain any other senators. There were a number of other senators that wanted to also comment. So,
but when it began, I told you I was going to skip over that page that has systems. Okay, well, I don't even need to go there. What I was going to ask you was to be able to go back there, because I'm trying to craft an amendment
Madam
with
Vice
the
Speaker, I'm just
Legislative
asking,
Council.
I'm just
and it's
asking the other
very
speakers who
difficult.
signified that they're interested in commenting, if we can yield to you. So you may proceed.
Thank you. I'm going to put off an amendment to systems. I would like to go back there later when I'm able with Legislative Council to finish drafting that. We are working on it, but we're not done. So I'd like to propose my other amendments, though, Mr. Chair. So there's 3 amendments that have been passed out on the floor, and the first one is that any contract, memorandum of agreement, or use agreement for Hotel Wharf must receive legislative approval. And this, of course, I have in mind what happened with the YTK, and I want to prevent that from happening again. And because in the Tiger Grant, it's a great grant, it's just not very specific what the port's exactly going to do there, and I would just like for the legislature to be included in that policy, and in any covenants, especially, and this is regarding the contracts, memorandums of agreements. I would like to make sure that the legislature reviews those. So that's what this amendment's all about, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Senators, there's a amendment that's being proffered by Vice Speaker Talahi. It should have been circulated as of yesterday. It reads, any contract, memorandum of agreement, or use agreement for Hotel Wharf must receive legislative approval. On that amendment, any discussions? This is, Madam Vice Speaker, this is to add a new section at the end. Okay. Yes, Senator Espadon, you recognize on the proposed amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to ask the Port Authority the question, and that would be that in the Tiger Grant, would this provision be in contravention to anything associated with the grant itself?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Senator Espadon. I mean, we are currently working with Merit and with the Department of Transportation in formalizing the agreement under the Tiger Grant to move forward with the actual projects. Of course, that's pending the Port Authority being able to obtain its share of the Tiger Grant. Overall, it's not just limited to the Tiger Grant. While I understand the history of YTK, and certainly we're no advocates of the fact that this agreement was ever entered into in the first place, I think even though we're going back to 2001, I don't understand the logic under which management and the board at the time authorized the use of this asset for private use. The intention, as we made very clear, in moving forward with the rehabilitation of Hotel Wharf, and this is also our representation to U.S. Department of Transportation when we applied for the Tiger Grant, is that we want to return Hotel Wharf back to a multi-use facility. And we discussed some of those things, such as the use and the movement of aggregate, the use of it for ro-ro vessels, the use of it for cruise vessels, also for vessels that have their own ship gear on board that does not require the use of our cranes. They could come in and operate out of Hotel Wharf if the need was there to do that due to existing traffic in our existing yard, or because that would be a facility that they could help move things through and stay on schedule. I do have concern with this language because at one end, and I understand because this is the vehicle before us, perhaps there are issues and concerns with the port that individually you may have, that you feel this is a vehicle to attach it to. At one end, we're saying, the port is an autonomous agency, and these matters really should be left to the discretion of the port and the port board. I mean, it's a public process that we undergo to do that. I would have a problem, for example, and we do have circumstances where we might have a short-term agreement, for example, with a company. Let me give you an example for aggregate, because that's some of the more recent case, where we had a company that's moving aggregate that is actually renting for a short period of time a certain amount of square footage in our yard because they need to maintain their conveyor belt facility there. It's a sizable piece of equipment, and they don't want to have to move it every few days or every 2 or 3 weeks, especially when they're anticipating within a short period of time shipments coming into the island. And we're able to rent that for very short. We might even just do it for sometimes a week or two, maybe in some cases it might be a month, so that they can store their equipment there. They pay for that space, and then as soon as the vessel comes in, they're able to continue, continue their movements. But if those type of things require the Port Authority of Guam to have to come to the Guam legislature, I think that's rather cumbersome and unnecessary. And then it actually, what type of autonomous agency do we have if we have to come to the Guam legislature to ask, authorization to use our wharf? And I look at Hotel Wharf as a continued extension of the existing facilities that we have there. Do I have to come here to check, if I need F3, F4, F5, F6 in terms of use? I think we made very clear our position in supporting the limitations of the legislation in place that actually limited to 5 years the ability of the port to enter into lease agreements. It is not the intention moving forward with the rehabilitation of this facility to turn it into what was originally, I guess, intended with that contract back in 2001 to construct a fisheries facility, essentially move that for such a long period of time out of the port's hands. Also keep in mind that as we move forward with the eventual, and it's not going to be maybe in the next 10 to 15 years, but 10 to 15 years go by very quickly. The time is going to come that those existing wharfs in the main yard are and will have to be rehabilitated. That's going to be a very cumbersome and very, very expensive process. And if we don't have alternate spaces to operate out of, which Hotel Wharf will provide, I think we're going to have tremendous challenges in maintaining the volume and ability to move cargo off vessels. So overall, I mean, I understand the intent, and I don't, I think I'm very much in line with the Vice Speaker's concern about any future misuse of Hotel Wharf. But I think with all the issues before us and awareness of this, to start preventing us from doing what we would do in the normal course of business would be very time-consuming and tremendously cumbersome.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Chair, and just to almost paraphrase, I mean, and again, I understand the concern of the mover of this amendment, but to paraphrase, I think what was just said is that this would almost come to the point of the legislature micromanaging the operations that should be best left probably to the discretion of the board and the management. I mean, and the director was correct that because this says any contract, memorandum of agreement or use agreement for Hotel Wharf, and again, I think this might be a little overreaching in terms of our power to micromanage an autonomous agency. So I'd be very careful in my deliberation on how to vote on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. On the proposed amendment, Senator Esteves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After hearing the explanation from the port, I do see the value of this amendment only because what we've seen historically. So I actually do, I believe I have a compromise, and I'd like to propose an amendment to the amendment. And the full amendment will read, any contract, memorandum of agreement, or use agreement for the consecutive use of Hotel Wharf in excess of 1 year must receive legislative approval. And I think maybe we can compromise on that number. If the port board needs to authorize a temporary use as a matter of day-to-day business or to generate revenue, I think that's fine. But I think limiting or preventing consecutive one-year agreements being put out to avoid legislative approval, I think is important. But I think any long-term agreement to Hotel Wharf in general, I think should have some input from the body of representatives, only because we've seen historically. So I think putting a time limit, as we've seen before, without us waiving our sovereign immunity as a body with language like this, I think is important. So if the port does decide to get into a long-term agreement while they're autonomous, we can come to this body and argue the merits on the benefit to the port, the benefit to everybody on the island, and then also the concerns of those on the island. So I believe 1 year should be long enough so that the port can still have the flexibility to handle the day-to-day, but I think anything in excess that can be construed as a long-term agreement for the use of Hotel Wharf, I think should have some legislative oversight and input.
Thank you, Senator Esteves. Senator Esteves, if you can just reread your proposed amendment to the amendment.
Any contract, memorandum of agreement, or use agreement for the consecutive use of Hotel Wharf in excess of 1 year must receive legislative approval.
Senators, you have that? So the amendment would be to insert for, between the words for and hotel, the consecutive use of, and then after the word wharf, insert in excess of 1 year. On the proposed amendment to the amendment, Senator Ada, you recognize.
We already have an existing statute in the Ports Enabling Act that requires that any contract in excess of 5 years must come down to the legislature for approval. In fact, I think that applies government-wide. And it was determined at the time that that was passed that 5 years, you know, anything beyond 5 years is long-term. So it's already something that requires when that sort of contract must come down. If this is in reaction to you know, the history of Hotel Wharf, this requirement was already in place. It was something just went wrong. They decided to blow off the legislature, and they went ahead and, you know, it got the governor's signature and all that. So it isn't as if this check and balance was. There's already an existing law to this effect. So if we then are to apply this to Hotel Wharf, then we're going to need additional language. I mean, I would presume we would need language, the notwithstanding section whatever, that requires that anything beyond 5 years come down here. Now we're saying anything, and then, you know, really the practicality of it is that if you're going to require anything more than 1 year, in fact, if you really take a look at the history of it, at one time, anything more than 30 days had to come down to the legislature, and then that got changed to 1 year, and then the practicality of it was just really, you know, impractical. So then it ended up with 5 years, and that 5 years applies to all government agencies.
Thank you very much, Senator Ada.
So I would object to that amendment.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Ada. Any further comment on the amendment, proposed amendment to the amendment?
Mr. Chair, if I can just comment on that.
Senator Esteves, will recognize Senator Espadon and then come back to you to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Any contract, memorandum of agreement, or use agreements for the consecutive use of Hotel Wharf in excess of 1 year must receive legislative approval. Basically does not preclude a contract to be made for a day less than 1 year and then a new contract for the same amount of time. So in practicality, even though the intent is there is a way to overcome this limitation by doing a contract for less than a year, and so it does not have to come before the legislature, but that contract, a new contract, could then be proposed and signed and entered into a day or two later, and with the same players and the same conditions, and so this would be rendered moot.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. Senator Esteves, I'll recognize you as we close on your amendment. Senator Ada, you have a follow-on comment?
Well, only that section of the law in the Ports Enabling Act actually anticipated that sort of thing. So the 5-year limit includes extensions. So yeah, you can go 1 year, 1 year, 1 year, but you know, when you come to the 6th year with that same player, it comes down here.
Thank you, Senator Ada. Any further discussion or comment on the amendment to the amendment? Senator Brown?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I understand the concerns that YTK has raised. I mean, trust me, we've spent many a day at the port having to deal with this challenge. And at the end of the day, I mean, other than addressing proper enforcement with the actions of public officials that do things contrary to the law, which is normally what should happen when people act contrary to the law and when they have responsibilities that, you know, are under them, which is, I very much believe, happened in this particular case. I just don't want to get to the point that this becomes cumbersome and difficult for the port. I don't foresee, after all these issues, that Hotel Wharf will be anything other than under the full possession of the port to operate as a multi-use facility. I think the segmenting or any attempt in the future to segment that property for private use, and there's all kinds of proposals out there. LNG is out there. I mean, everybody out there that wants to look at additional properties at the port that's connected to the water has looked at Hotel Wharf. But at the end of the day, in terms of our current operations and what we anticipate in the next few years, Hotel Wharf needs to be an integral part of the port operations, and I simply look at it as an extension of the existing wharfs that we have. The cost to build a new facility like this, a whole brand new facility, or if we were to build F7, you know, it's going to be quite significant. And in the short term, I don't see that happening in the next 10 or 15 years. I think what we need to accommodate our demands now, and if you do talk to the carriers, the response with regards to refurbishing Hotel Wharf is all favorable. They all agree that we need, for a variety of purposes in their own operations, that we need to return this to a multi-use facility for the port that allows all of them access, should the need be there, for them to use that facility. But again, I don't want to, from the port's perspective, to really get caught. You know, at one end we're saying we have full autonomy to operate as we need to, and then at the other end, because of this one situation with YTK, we've got to come back on, you know, every year to get approval from the Guam Legislature. I don't see how this occurs with any other autonomous agency. I mean, if the airport wants to lease out its space for a restaurant facility, or, I'm sorry, if you can allow me to comment, I think we're at committee. I just want to be able to finish my comments here to the ramifications of this. If the airport were to lease out for a retail...
There's no $14 million obligation by any other autonomous agency that we are facing, Mr. Chair. And if we could just vote on the motion.
I understand, sir, but at the other end, I assume we're here to provide the input from the side of the port, because at the end of the day, Mr. Chairman, we're the ones that actually have to operate with what you're giving us. So I'm simply pointing out an example with the Guam Airport Authority. I mean, the airport doesn't come down if they're renting for a restaurant or a retailer or whatever the case may be. They have to go through their process to do that. It is a public process. I don't know how this slipped through the, you know, how that issue 2001 slipped through the attention at the time. But it does become cumbersome if we have to come back. I mean, this bill in particular has already taken us 10 months from the time it was introduced. It makes it difficult for us just to do normal operations that we should be able to do without having to come back time and time again here.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Thank you, Senator. Senator Esteves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I think there's one thing that's guaranteed, you know, and I've said this before. It's guaranteed that the port board is not always going to be the port board. The director is not going to always be the director. And as senators, we're not always going to be senators. That is absolutely guaranteed. We cannot foresee the future. We can only look back at history and really see what has happened. We
okay,
really
I'm
don't.
Sorry, Senator Esteves, with all due respect.
This is to the amendment.
No, this is on the entire amendment. Senators, I apologize. I did not recognize this, but this is not germane to the borrowing component, and this is specific, and it could make it a significant deviation from the provisions that is being entertained on the floor. So this amendment, this particular amendment, is not accepted for discussion. Thank you,
object, Mr. Chair. This borrowing includes borrowing.
I understand.
I don't.
Your provision
let me see the amount for Hotel Wharf in particular, and if we can't control what's going to happen to that.
Did you want to overrule the decision of the chair? Because this is with respect to a particular facility within the port. We're talking about a bond borrowing.
To one of the items listed in the projects that is going to be funded out of the proceeds of this bond.
Madam Vice Speaker, you have an option to overrule the chair. Did you want to do so? Because we're sticking with the intent of the legislation. It's to borrow with the specific purpose of repairing and upgrading the critical infrastructure outlined in the bill.
And in borrowing, we're putting restrictions on the entire government of Guam.
Madam
and now you're
Vice
saying
Speaker,
that putting a restriction on the port is
Did you want to move
not
to overrule
germane?
the chair? That's an option available to you.
I would like to ask for a recess, Mr. Chair.
5-minute recess. Senators, the committee in the whole is hereby reconvened. Unless there's a motion to override the decision of the chair, we will proceed with Senator Talahi presenting her next amendment when we resume at 2 p.m. We are hereby in recess until 2 p.m. this afternoon.